In Pine Grove, Montana, the Thunder Creek motorcycle gang thought they had found their perfect target, a blind woman who would never be able to identify them. What they didn't count on was her husband, Thomas Reed. Not just any retired Marine, but one of the most decorated sharpshooters in military history. Now, as the gang's act of intimidation spirals into a desperate fight for survival, they're about to learn that taking the wrong person's wife could be the final mistake they ever make. Because when you threaten someone trained to hit targets from a mile away, your biggest problem isn't the victim who can't see you, it's the hunter who never misses. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crisp Montana morning painted Pine Grove's main street in shades of autumn gold, mountain air carrying the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. Margaret Reed's white cane tapped rhythmically against the sidewalk as she made her way toward Henderson's general store, each movement precise and confident despite her blindness. 7 years of navigating the small mountain town without sight had honed her other senses to remarkable acuity. "Morning, Mrs. Reed," called Bill Henderson from his storefront. "Just got those fresh Honeycrisp apples in from the Wilson orchard." Margaret turned toward his voice, smiling. "Save me a dozen, Bill. Thomas has been asking for that apple butter recipe I learned from my grandmother." Behind his counter, Bill watched as Margaret navigated the narrow aisles with practiced ease, her fingers brushing lightly over items, reading the braille labels he'd helped add to his shelves years ago. The bell above the door chimed, and 3 leather-clad figures entered, their heavy boots scraping against the worn wooden floor. "We don't want any trouble," Bill said quietly, noting their Thunder Creek patches. Marcus Leone, towering over the counter, smiled without warmth. "Just passing through, old-timer, getting a feel for the local atmosphere." Margaret tensed slightly, her trained ears picking up the subtle shift in the store's energy. 23 years as a trauma nurse had taught her to read a room, even without sight. Something was wrong. At home, Thomas Reed stood by the kitchen window, his morning coffee cooling forgotten in his hand. The Thunder Creek gang's presence in town wasn't a coincidence. 4 more bikes had rolled past the house this morning, the riders paying too much attention to his property. His Marine Corps training, decades old but never forgotten, prickled a warning. "Sheriff Cooper," Thomas spoke into his phone, voice low. "Those new visitors we discussed, they're getting bolder." David Cooper sighed on the other end. 5 incidents. This week already. Vandalism at Murphy's Bar, harassment at the diner, but they're careful. Nothing we can pin on them directly. "They're scouting," Thomas replied, years of combat experience coloring his words. "Question is, for what?" Back at Henderson's, Margaret felt the presence of one of the bikers close behind her as she reached for a can of soup. His leather jacket creaked as he leaned in. "Need some help there, lady?" The voice was falsely solicitous, carrying an undertone of mockery. "No, thank you," Margaret replied evenly, placing the can in her basket. "I manage just fine." "Shame about those eyes." "Another," Ryder commented. "Accident, was it?" Margaret's spine stiffened. The incident at the hospital 7 years ago hadn't been an accident, though they'd made it look that way. She'd been asking too many questions about missing medication, suspicious deaths. Then came the equipment malfunction during a routine procedure. "Time to head home," she said calmly, moving toward the counter. Bill quickly rang up her items, his hands shaking slightly. "Let me help you with those bags," Leone offered, reaching for her groceries. "That won't be necessary." Thomas's voice cut through the tension. He stood in the doorway, his presence filling the small store. To casual observers, he was just a concerned husband in his late 50s. But Margaret heard the steel beneath his gentle tone, the same steady voice that had once called out wind. "Adjustments for 1,000-yard shots, just being neighborly," Leone replied, backing away with exaggerated courtesy. His eyes, however, remained fixed on Margaret as she took Thomas's arm. Outside, autumn leaves skittered across the sidewalk as the Reeds walked home. Thomas's posture was relaxed, but his senses were alert, cataloguing details with professional precision. Two more bikes parked around the corner, a man in a leather vest watching from the diner, phones coming out, photos being taken. "They're planning something," Margaret murmured, her grip tightening slightly on his arm. "Yes," Thomas agreed quietly, "and we need to find out what before someone gets hurt." What neither of them realized was that the Thunder Creek gang's presence in Pine Grove was just the surface. Beneath the small-town tensions, a much larger operation was taking shape. And Margaret Reed, the blind nurse who couldn't identify her attackers, was about to become the key to exposing it all. As evening settled over the town, Thomas made a series of calls to old contacts, people who owed him favors from his Marine Corps days. Something about the Thunder Creek gang's sudden interest in Pine Grove didn't add up. The pieces were there, but the pattern remained elusive. In the garage of the abandoned lumber mill on the edge of town, Marcus Leone studied photos of Margaret's daily routines spread across a makeshift table. A blind woman, he mused, who used to be a nurse, perfect leverage for what's coming. His phone buzzed with a message from higher up the chain. Proceed with acquisition. The autumn wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of an early winter storm. In the Reed household, Margaret prepared dinner, her movements confident in her familiar kitchen. Thomas watched through the window as another motorcycle cruised past, too slowly to be casual. The game was about to begin, but the Thunder Creek gang was playing by the wrong rules. Measuring success by what they could see, they were about to learn that in Pine Grove, the most dangerous players were the ones hiding in plain sight, especially a man who had spent his career making impossible shots from invisible positions. Through the kitchen window, Thomas tracked the bike's progress, his mind automatically calculating distance, wind speed, potential angles, old habits that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. But now those skills might be needed for something far more personal than any military mission. The Thunder Creek gang was about to learn that taking a blind woman hostage was their first mistake. Underestimating her husband would be their last. Margaret's hands moved expertly over the kitchen counter, preparing the evening meal with practiced precision. She could feel Thomas's tension. After 20 years of marriage, she didn't need sight to read his moods. His footsteps carried a different rhythm tonight, the careful pattern of a man assessing threats. "Sarah from the clinic called today," Margaret said, slicing vegetables with practiced ease. 3 more patients have gone missing from the long-term care ward, just like at my old hospital before." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Thomas watched another Thunder Creek bike cruise past their house, the rider's head turning too obviously toward their windows. "Same pattern?" he asked, his voice carrying the focused calm she recognized from his competition days. Identical. Vulnerable patients, no family connections, perfect targets for... Margaret's knife paused mid-cut. The Thunder Creek gang wasn't in Burlington last month when those patients disappeared from Central Hospital, were they? Thomas was already moving to his study, where a detailed map of Montana covered one wall. Red pins marked recent Thunder Creek sightings. Blue pins indicated hospitals reporting missing patients. The pattern was there, but something was still missing. In the abandoned lumber mill, Leone received another message. "Time window closing. Asset must be acquired within 48 hours." The garage door creaked as his lieutenant, Jake "Snake" Morrison, entered. "Got word from our friends at County. General, 3 more volunteers processed through their system last week," Leone nodded, studying Margaret's photo. "And now we have a witness who was getting too close to the operation 7 years ago. One who conveniently can't identify anyone." "Boss," Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Word is, her husband ain't just any retired Marine. Reed was legendary in the Corps. They called him Ghost." 47 confirmed kills from over a mile out. Man could hit targets others couldn't even see. Leone's lips curved in a cold smile. A blind woman and an old sniper, past their prime, both of them. By this time tomorrow, they won't be our problem anymore. Back at the Reed house, Thomas's phone buzzed. The caller ID showed Martinez, USMC Scout Sniper School. Ghost, the familiar voice brought memories of desert training grounds. Got your message. You were right about Thunder Creek. They're not just a gang anymore. Private military connections, high-end tactical gear. Someone's bankrolling them, turning thugs into soldiers. Thomas watched the evening shadows lengthen across their yard. Perfect concealment positions in the tree line. Clear fields of fire from the upper windows. Old habits. Any connection to the missing patients? Working on it. But Ghost, be careful. These aren't just bikers playing soldiers. Some of their new members have serious combat experience. Whoever's running this operation, a motorcycle engine roared past, deliberately loud. Thomas caught the glint of a camera lens. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. In the kitchen, Margaret's fingers found a small piece of paper tucked inside a delivered grocery bag, braille dots pressed into the surface. They're watching, Tuesday, be ready. The message was from Carol Henderson, Bill's wife. 7 years without sight had taught Margaret to cultivate information networks others didn't notice. While the Thunder Creek gang watched their house, Margaret had her own sources: shopkeepers, nurses, cleaning staff, people the gang overlooked. Thomas, she called softly, remember what you taught me about creating a fatal funnel? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her husband's footsteps approached, carrying that deadly grace she'd first noticed when they met at the VA hospital. They're expecting us to fortify the house, he replied, understanding immediately. Standard defensive position. Margaret smiled slightly, her fingers still tracing the warning note. But they don't know about the tunnel system under Pine Grove. The old mining shafts I memorized when I was mapping emergency evacuation routes for the hospital. Thomas's hand found her shoulder, squeezing gently. The touch carried decades of trust and partnership. They think taking your sight makes you vulnerable. Instead, Margaret finished, it made me notice things others miss. Like the fact that the Thunder Creek gang always attacks on Tuesdays, always when shift changes at the hospitals create gaps in the security logs. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching snow. In the lumber mill, Leone mobilized his men, confident in their superior numbers and tactical gear. But he'd made a crucial mistake, one that had ended many lives during Thomas Reed's military career. He assumed superior equipment meant superior strategy. But Thomas hadn't. Earned the name Ghost with fancy gear. He'd done it by understanding that the most dangerous position isn't always the most obvious one. As darkness fell over Pine Grove, two highly trained professionals prepared for very different kinds of warfare. Leone, with his modern tactical gear and private military backing, and Thomas Reed, who had spent decades learning that the deadliest shot often comes from where the enemy least expects it. The Thunder Creek gang was about to learn that some people are more dangerous when they're underestimated. A blind woman who could navigate darkness better than they could, and a sniper who had built his legend on being invisible. Because sometimes the most effective weapon isn't what you can see. It's understanding that true strength often comes from learning to work without sight at all. Thomas spent the next hour checking his personal arsenal, each weapon maintained with the same precision that once made him a legend in the Corps. In the basement gun safe, his customized M24 rifle waited. The same one that had earned him commendations in 3 different combat zones. But it was the newer additions that reflected their current reality: specialized home defense gear, close-quarters weapons, equipment chosen for protecting rather than engaging at a distance. Margaret moved through the house, her mental map crystal clear. "They're changing their patrol pattern," she noted, head tilting slightly. "The bikes are passing every 15 minutes now instead of 30. More engines, at least 3 new ones I don't recognize." Thomas watched another rider cruise past, different bikes, higher end, custom exhaust systems, military-grade communications gear. These aren't normal Thunder Creek members. In his study, the phone buzzed again. This time it was Cooper. "Thomas, you need to see this. County records just flagged something. Remember that equipment malfunction that cost Margaret her sight? Same type of incident was reported at 3 other hospitals in the past month." "Where?" "That's the thing. Each location corresponds with increased Thunder Creek activity. They move in, patients start disappearing. Then accidents happen to anyone asking questions." At the lumber mill, Leone received a secure video call. The figure on the screen remained in shadows, voice distorted. "Asset acquisition is behind schedule. The board is concerned." "Reed's reputation is complicating things," Leone replied. His service record is precisely why this needs to happen now," the voice cut in. "He's already connecting dots we can't afford to have connected. The woman knows too much about the hospital operations, even if she can't see what's happening. By this time tomorrow, I want both problems eliminated." Morrison studied the tactical map, marking potential approach routes to the Reed house. "Going to be tricky. Their property has clear lines of sight in every direction, perfect setup for a sniper." Leone smiled coldly. "Then we change the game, draw them out, make them play on our terms." Margaret's fingers moved across her old hospital ID card, feeling the subtle differences in texture that most people would miss. "Thomas, what if the equipment malfunction wasn't just about silencing me? What if they were testing something?" Her husband's footsteps paused. "Testing what?" "At each hospital where patients disappeared, there were reports of unusual medication combinations being used. Experimental protocols. I was investigating missing drugs when the accident happened." Thomas's mind worked through the implications. The Thunder Creek gang providing muscle, hospitals being used as testing grounds. His phone buzzed with a message from Martinez. "Ghost, found your connection. 3 of Thunder Creek's new members, former military contractors, worked for a private security firm called Ravencroft Solutions. They specialize in medical logistics." Outside, the wind carried the rumble of more motorcycles. Margaret's head tilted. "That's 12 bikes now. They're setting up a perimeter." In the lumber mill's tactical operations room, Leone briefed his strike team. "Primary target is the woman. Reed's dangerous, but he's predictable. Threaten him, and he'll try to protect her." That's when a subordinate burst in. "Boss, we got in trouble. Just intercepted a call. Reed's been contacting old military connections. Someone's asking questions about Ravencroft." The secure video line crackled. "This changes nothing. Accelerate the timeline. And Leone, no witnesses. The program can't afford exposure." Thomas moved through the house, checking sight lines and angles. Years of combat experience catalogued every approach, every vulnerability. But something felt wrong. The Thunder Creek gang was being too obvious, too aggressive. "They want us focused. On the house," Margaret said softly, her fingers trailing along the wall. "While something else is happening." Her cane tapped thoughtfully against the floor. "Thomas, call Carol Henderson again. Ask her about the hospital supply deliveries, the ones that always come on Tuesdays. Because while the Thunder Creek gang watched their house with high-tech gear and tactical training, they'd overlooked something crucial. A blind woman who had spent years learning to notice patterns others missed. And a sniper who had built his career on understanding that the most obvious target is often a distraction from the real objective. In Pine Grove, the pieces of a deadly puzzle were falling into place. But the Thunder Creek Gang was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous adversaries aren't the ones you can see coming. They're the ones who have learned to work in darkness, who understand that true power often lies in what others overlook. A blind woman who could read patterns in sound and movement, and a sniper who had spent decades proving that the deadliest shot comes from where the enemy least expects it. The storm was coming, and with it, the truth about what was really happening in Pine Grove was about to be exposed. Dawn painted Pine Grove in shades of grey as Margaret made her way to St. Paul's Church for her weekly volunteer work. The morning air carried the sharp scent of approaching snow, and her cane tapped steadily against the familiar sidewalk. Thomas watched from their porch, noting the black SUV that had passed by twice already. "The usual route?" he asked, his tone casual, but his mind mapping contingencies. "Of course," Margaret replied, adjusting her scarf. "Sister Catherine needs help organizing the food bank. I should be back by noon." 3 blocks away, Marcus Leone spoke quietly into a tactical radio. "Target moving just like clockwork." Behind him, 4 men checked weapons concealed under leather jackets. They'd studied Margaret's routine for days, noting every detail, every schedule. The attack came at the corner of Cedar and Main, where construction noise from roadwork would mask any commotion. Margaret heard the SUV's door slide open, sensed the rapid footsteps approaching. Her self-defense training kicked in, another gift from Thomas. But they'd planned for that. "Now," Leone ordered. 2 men grabbed her arms while another pressed a chloroform-soaked cloth over her face. Her cane clattered to the sidewalk as consciousness faded. Within minutes, the SUV was gone, leaving only scattered leaves and Margaret's broken phone. A construction worker watched silently, the Thunder Creek Gang's payoff heavy in his pocket. Thomas felt it before he heard anything. Years of combat instinct screamed danger. He was already moving when Sheriff Cooper's patrol car screamed around the corner. "Reed! Margaret's cane was found on Cedar. Signs of struggle." Thomas's face remained impassive, but his mind was already processing data. Time frame less than 10 minutes ago. Multiple witnesses saw a black SUV, no plates. "They'll switch vehicles," Thomas said, his sniper's training surfacing. "Not their first operation." "Call Detective Maxwell." Cooper hesitated. "The FBI's been monitoring Thunder Creek activity across state lines. Agent Sarah Chen's been called. Inside their house, Thomas accessed his gun's safe, selecting weapons with practiced efficiency. His fingers moved across the M24's familiar contours as his mind calculated ranges, angles, potential positions. Detective Maxwell arrived 20 minutes later, finding Thomas studying a map of the area. "We've got roadblocks up, but they won't use." "Main roads," Maxwell started. "Check traffic cameras near the old lumber mill," Thomas interrupted. "That's their staging area." "How could you know that?" "Because I've been watching them watch Margaret. The mill gives them cover, multiple escape routes, and access to the highway." Thomas turned to the detective. "But they made 3 mistakes. First, they think they took her to prevent her from identifying them. Second, they're not watching me. And third," he pulled up surveillance photos on his laptop, "they don't know what she discovered at the hospital 7 years ago." Maxwell studied the photos. "What are we really dealing with here, Reed?" "Look at their new members." Thomas pointed to several faces. "Ex-military, specialized training. Someone's building a professional operation under the cover of a motorcycle." "Gang!" Agent Chen arrived as they talked, her FBI credentials catching the morning light. "Mr. Reed, I understand you have relevant combat experience." "Former Marine Scout sniper," Thomas replied, noting her slight surprise. "And I know why you're really here. The Thunder Creek Gang's sudden expansion, their new recruitment patterns. You're not investigating a gang. You're hunting something bigger." Chen's expression tightened. "Your wife's kidnapping may connect to a larger operation we've been tracking. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking, all using motorcycle gangs as cover. And 7 years ago, Margaret noticed something at the hospital. Thomas pulled out an old file. She was investigating before the accident that took her sight. Cooper swore softly. "You think they're connected?" "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that Thunder Creek's arrival in Pine Grove isn't a coincidence. Margaret's kidnapping isn't random intimidation. They want something specific." A burner phone, one of several Thomas had cached around town, buzzed, with coordinates followed by 2 words, "moving target." "I need 30 minutes, Thomas told Chen. "Then I'll show you what Margaret discovered and why Thunder Creek is just the beginning." At an abandoned hunting cabin outside town, Eric Torres, Thomas's former spotter from his Marine days, waited with a laptop. Facial recognition had confirmed 6 of the new Thunder Creek members. They're former Special Forces, he reported, all with connections to Ravencroft Solutions. Someone's building an army, using the gang for cover. But the real operation is something else entirely. Thomas studied the data. There's more. That hospital incident 7 years ago found a connection to Ravencroft, same firm that just hired 3 ex-Thunder Creek members. The pieces started falling into place. Margaret's investigation, her blinding, the gang's arrival in Pine Grove, all connected to something bigger, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Back in town, Cooper reported increased Thunder Creek activity. "They're moving something big through the old logging roads, multiple vehicles, armed escorts." Thomas checked his weapons carefully. "Agent Chen, you wanted to know what we're dealing with. Thunder Creek took my wife because they think she's helpless, because they think being blind means she can't identify them. But Margaret doesn't need eyes to know what she discovered. And now they've given us the perfect opportunity to expose their entire operation." As storm clouds gathered over Pine Grove, Thomas Reed prepared for war, not the kind he'd fought in combat zones, or even the precision game of a sniper. This was personal. Thunder Creek thought they'd chosen an easy target. Instead, they'd started a chain reaction that would tear their criminal empire apart. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains. The storm was coming, and with it, the dark truth about what was really happening in Pine Grove was about to be exposed. Margaret Reed sat perfectly still in her chair, counting footsteps and cataloguing voices. Her captors had made the mistake of assuming her blindness meant helplessness. Instead, 20 years of nursing had taught her to build detailed mental maps from sound and touch. The lumber mill was large, industrial. She could tell from the lingering smell of sawdust and machine oil. The acoustics told her she was in a converted office space, probably on the upper level. "The boss wants her questioned," a gruff voice ordered. "Find out what she remembers about the hospital records." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. They'd revealed more than they knew with those words. The connection between her old investigation and their current operation was confirmed. Meanwhile, Thomas worked methodically in their home office, surrounded by maps and surveillance photos. Agent Chen watched as his fingers traced supply routes. Thunder Creek moved into 3 other towns before Pine Grove, Thomas explained. Each one near a medical facility, each followed by an increase in missing patients. "But they're not just taking random targets," Chen added. "Our analysts found specific patterns, vulnerable patients, no family connections, perfect for testing," Thomas finished grimly. "Just like the accident that took Margaret's sight." Cooper burst in, breathing hard. "We found one of them. Thunder Creek members drunk at Murphy's bar, bragging about the kidnapping. The biker, Joey Switchblade." Parker was still nursing his whiskey when Thomas walked into Murphy's bar. The evening crowd parted silently, sensing the coming storm. "Where is she?" Thomas's voice carried across the suddenly quiet room. Parker sneered, alcohol boosting his courage. "The blind lady? Maybe she wandered into traffic." The next moments happened too fast for the bar's patrons to follow. Thomas moved, with the fluid efficiency of decades of training. Parker found himself face down on the bar, arm twisted behind him before he could reach for his knife. "Let's try again," Thomas said quietly. "But this time, remember, my wife may be blind, but I see everything, including what your crew moved through the logging roads this morning." Parker's bravado cracked. "You can't. The boss will kill me." "The boss isn't here. I am." 10 minutes later, Thomas had a location and something more valuable, confirmation of his suspicions. Thunder Creek wasn't just providing muscle. They were working with someone inside the hospital system, someone who could provide access to patients. At the FBI's temporary command center, Agent Chen received an urgent report. Satellite imaging confirmed activity at the lumber mill, but there was more. They'd found shell companies linking Thunder Creek to Ravencroft Solutions. "They're not just providing security," Chen told Thomas, spreading out property records. "Ravencroft just bought 3 warehouses near medical centers in Missoula, perfect distribution points, and perfect covers for what they're really moving," Thomas added. "Patients, vulnerable people who won't be missed." Detective Maxwell spread out property records. "Ravencroft just purchased an abandoned psychiatric facility in Idaho, but look at these shipping manifests, medical equipment, specialized restraints, security systems, everything you'd need to hold people against their will." Thomas finished. "Margaret must have spotted the pattern at the hospital. Legitimate patients being transferred, then disappearing into the system." At the mill, Margaret heard vehicles arriving, her other senses heightened by years without sight, picking up details her captors didn't realize they were revealing. The newcomers moved differently, professional military training rather than biker swagger. "Everything set?" A new voice asked. "Educated, corporate." Margaret memorized its distinctive pattern. "The blind nurse doesn't know anything," Leone reported, "but her husband is becoming a problem. Our hospital connection says he's asking questions about Ravencroft. Make sure Mrs. Reed has an unfortunate accident. Make it look random." Margaret's fingers found a loose screw on her chair. Years of navigating without sight had taught her patience, precision. She began working it free as she listened. Thomas and Chen approached the mill from different directions, FBI tactical teams moving into position while local police secured the perimeter. But Thomas knew Thunder Creek would have scouts watching. 3. "Men in the tree line," he whispered into his radio. "Another 2 on the roof. Professional setup. These aren't just bikers." "How do you want to play this?" Chen asked. "They'll be expecting a frontal assault, standard FBI tactics." Thomas checked his weapon. "So let's give them something else, something they're not trained for." The first explosion hit the mill's generator, plunging the building into darkness. The second took out their communications relay. As Thunder Creek scrambled to respond, Thomas was already moving through their blind spots, using skills honed over decades of combat operations. Margaret heard the chaos erupting outside. More importantly, she heard the fear in her captors' voices. These weren't the confident criminals of an hour ago. Now they were rattled, making mistakes. The screw came free in her hand. Thomas's voice came through Chen's radio. "Target building compromised. Be advised, armed security teams on site. These aren't gang members. They're private military contractors." "Copy," Chen replied. "FBI tactical moving in. But Reed, we need evidence linking Ravencroft to the hospital incidents. Without proof, they'll bury this under corporate paperwork." Inside the mill, Thomas moved like a ghost through the chaos. Years of sniper operations had taught him to use confusion as a weapon. Thunder Creek and their professional backup found themselves fighting shadows. Meanwhile, Margaret in the darkness worked methodically toward her own escape. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke over Pine Grove as lighting illuminated the mill in stark flashes. Thunder Creek was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous adversaries are the ones you underestimate. A blind Woman who sees more than they realize, and a former sniper who never stopped watching the shadows. Lightning flashed through the mill's broken windows as Sarah worked her way through the darkness, her fingers tracing along the wall, building a mental map of her surroundings. The chaos of the firefight outside provided perfect cover as guards ran about, shouting orders, their professional discipline cracking under pressure. "Lock down the lower level," the educated voice commanded, now sharp with panic. "The files can't fall into federal hands." Margaret heard filing cabinets being opened, papers being hastily gathered. More importantly, she heard the distinctive click of a safe opening. 7 years without sight had taught her to notice details others missed. Outside, Thomas moved through the storm like a ghost. 2 Ravencroft operators guarded the mill's side entrance, their tactical gear and professional stance marking them as former military. They never saw him coming. "Reed's inside," one guard reported through his radio before Thomas disabled him. In the FBI command vehicle, Agent Chen received urgent intel. Satellite shows more vehicles approaching from the north. Black SUVs, not biker transport. Corporate cleanup crew. Thomas's voice crackled through her earpiece. "They're trying to evacuate key personnel and documents." "Reed," Chen's tone changed. "We just got confirmation on those shell companies. Ravencroft isn't just providing security. They're owned by North Star Medical Solutions, the same company that supplies half the hospitals in the Northwest." Thomas confirmed quietly. Margaret was right. The missing patients, the illegal testing, it's all connected to legitimate medical distribution. Inside, Margaret heard the educated voice issuing evacuation orders. Papers rustled, hard drives were being destroyed, but they'd forgotten about her in their panic, assuming a blind woman was safely contained. Their mistake. Her hands found a metal filing cabinet, inside folders labeled in Braille. Another mistake. They'd kept the hospital's original files, including the ones she'd marked before losing her sight. Evidence of patient transfers, unexplained. Deaths, all connecting to North Star Medical. Thomas encountered his first real resistance at the loading dock. 3 Ravencroft operators, professionally positioned, covering all angles. But they were expecting FBI tactical teams, not a sniper, who'd spent decades learning to exploit blind spots. "Target approaching the East Corridor," one operator reported. "Negative," Thomas's voice came from behind them. "Target's already here." The fight was brief, efficient. Thomas moved with the economy of motion that came from years of real-world experience rather than training courses. Within moments, he had access to the loading dock security office and its computers. "Chen," he transmitted, "getting you access to their network now, but we need to hurry. They're initiating emergency protocols." Margaret heard more vehicles arriving outside. Heavy footsteps approached her position, private military contractors, not bikers, judging by their movement patterns. She clutched the folders to her chest and pressed deeper into the shadows. In the command vehicle, Chen's team worked frantically to download data. "Reed, we've got internal emails. North Star was using Ravencroft to protect more than shipments. They were running unauthorized drug trials through the hospitals, using Thunder Creek's distribution network to move experimental pharmaceuticals." Thomas added grimly, "Testing them on vulnerable patients. That's what Margaret discovered 7 years ago." A new voice cut through the radio chatter. "Target located. She's got the files." Margaret heard them approaching from both directions. But 7 years of navigating without sight had given her advantages they didn't expect. In complete darkness, she moved confidently while they stumbled. James heard the transmission and changed direction, heading deeper into the mill. But more Ravencroft operators were arriving, cutting off escape routes. These weren't Thunder Creek riders playing at being soldiers. These were experienced professionals protecting corporate interests. "Reed," Chen warned. "Satellite shows helicopters inbound. Corporate extraction teams. They're going to try to clean the scene completely." In the mill's office section, the educated voice became urgent. "Forget the woman. Burn everything. Initiate Protocol Omega. Margaret recognized the sound of gas. Valves being opened. They were planning to destroy the evidence and anyone who might have seen it. But she had an advantage. Years of working in hospitals had taught her to recognize the smell of gas, to know exactly how it moved through enclosed spaces. Thomas, she transmitted through a phone she'd taken from an unconscious guard. They're flooding the lower levels with gas, but I've got the files, original hospital records showing everything, the drug trials, the deaths, all of it. Copy, Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the gunfire in the background. Margaret, remember that time in the hospital basement when you taught the new nurses to navigate during the power outage? Margaret smiled, understanding immediately. In darkness, she was in her element. East Corridor, she responded. Storage room 3. I can hear the ventilation fan. Thomas moved with renewed purpose, using the chaos of the evacuation to his advantage. The Ravencroft operators were professional, but they'd never trained for this. A target who could move invisibly through their defenses, and a blind woman who could navigate darkness better than they could. Jen, Thomas transmitted. We need a distraction, something to draw their corporate cleanup crew away from the east side. Already on it, Chen replied. FBI tactical moving in from the west, making lots of noise. The storm intensified. Rain, hammering against the mill's metal roof. Margaret heard the helicopters approaching, felt the change in air pressure as teams of corporate cleaners moved through the building. But they were looking in the wrong places, checking lit areas while she moved through the shadows. Thomas encountered another Ravencroft team, this one moving with the precision of Special Forces veterans. But their technical expertise worked against them. They relied too heavily on communications, on night vision equipment, on modern tactical doctrine. Target moving through Sector 4, their leader reported. Wrong, Thomas said softly, appearing where they least expected. You're not hunting me. I'm hunting you. The fight that followed was swift, brutal, and entirely professional. No wasted motion, no dramatic moves, just the applied violence of a man who'd spent decades learning its most efficient forms. In the command vehicle, Chen received urgent updates. Read, we've got a problem. Just identified one of the corporate cleanup leaders, former special forces, someone who knows your playbook. They still don't know Margaret's playbook, Thomas replied, and right now that's what matters. Lightning flashed again as Margaret moved through the darkness, carrying evidence that would expose decades of corporate crimes. Around her, professional killers searched with modern equipment, never realizing their target moved more confidently in darkness than they did in light. The storm over Pine Grove reached its peak as the final confrontation approached. In the darkness of the old mill, a blind woman who saw the truth and a former sniper who never stopped watching were about to expose a conspiracy that reached from small-town Montana to the highest levels of corporate power. Rain drummed against the mill's roof as Margaret pressed against a wall, listening to footsteps echo through the corridors. Corporate cleanup teams moved with military precision, but they made a crucial mistake. Their tactical communications created a map of sound she could follow. Team 2, clear the east wing, a voice ordered through their radios. Team 3, maintain the perimeter. Subject Reed has the facility layout. Expect unconventional tactics. In the security office, Thomas accessed the mill's systems through a terminal the evacuation team had missed. Chen, you're getting this. Full shipping manifests from North Star Medical. They're using Thunder Creek to distribute more than just stolen pharmaceuticals. Confirmed, Chen replied. Experimental drugs, untested compounds. They're using gang territories as testing grounds. Christ, these casualty reports. A new voice cut through their channel, cultured, authoritative. Hello, Thomas. Been a long time. Thomas's expression hardened. Richard Hayes, still cleaning up corporate messes? You know how it works. Companies like North Star need people who understand discretion, just like our old days in Force Recon. We never tested drugs on innocent people. No, we just eliminated threats. Don't pretend you have the moral high ground. Hayes's tone shifted. The board wants this contained, Thomas. Stand down. Let us handle the cleanup. You know how this ends otherwise. Margaret heard the exchange through her stolen radio. More importantly, she heard what they didn't say. The slight tension in Hayes's voice suggesting time pressure, the background sounds indicating his position in the mill's executive office. Marcus Leone watched from the loading dock as more corporate teams arrived. This isn't what we signed up for, he muttered to his lieutenant. They're going to burn us along with the evidence. Status, Thomas whispered. Third floor, north side, Margaret responded softly. They're moving something heavy from the executive office. Metal cases, possibly servers. Hayes is trying to protect the data, all their research, test results, distribution networks. Thomasy disabled another guard. Chen, how long until your teams can breach? 10 minutes. But Thomas, we just identified Hayes's boss. Alexander Cross himself is on site. CEO of North Star Medical. This goes higher than we thought. In the executive office, Alexander Cross, CEO of North Star Medical Solutions, watched tactical teams sweep the building. This location is compromised. Initiate full sanitization protocol. Sir, Hayes cautioned, we haven't found the woman or the original files yet. Then find them. Everything we've built is in those records. 20 years of research, billions in development. I won't let some blind nurse and her ex-sniper husband destroy that. Margaret felt the vibrations through the floor as heavy equipment was moved into position. Her years in hospital maintenance gave her an advantage. She recognized the sound of industrial fuel pumps. They were preparing to burn the building. Thomas encountered heavier resistance near the executive level. These weren't just Ravencroft operators. They were former Force Recon, men who'd worked with Hayes in the past. The fighting was close, technical, a deadly game of experience versus experience. Reed's good, one team leader reported. He's using old Marine Scout sniper infiltration patterns because he knows we expect modern tactical responses, Hayes replied. Switch to analog communications, no radios. But Margaret heard the order, understood its implications. Without radio discipline, the teams made more noise, creating more echoes she could track. Thomas, she whispered, they're falling back to the executive suite, taking something with them. Sounds like servers, hard drives. Copy. Thomas engaged. Another team. His movements economical, precise. Chen, we need that breach now. They're going to destroy everything, including witnesses. In the command vehicle, Chen received urgent intelligence. Satellite shows more helicopters incoming. These aren't corporate, they're private military. Hayes is calling in his own cleanup crew. Leone made his decision, gathering his remaining Thunder Creek riders. We're being set up. Time to choose sides. He keyed his radio. Reed, north entrance is clear. We'll handle any corporate teams that come through there. Appreciated. Thomas replied, understanding the shift in allegiance. But get your people out. This isn't your kind of fight anymore. In the executive office, Cross received confirmation from his board. Containment authorized. Full sanitization, sir, Hayes cautioned. Burning the mill with everyone inside. That's more than just cleanup. That's mass murder. This company provides medications to millions, Cross snapped. Our research will save countless lives. I won't let it be destroyed by outdated ethics and bureaucratic restrictions. Margaret heard the fuel pumps engage, smelled the accelerant being spread. But she also heard something else, the unique acoustic signature of the mill's old ventilation system. As a blind woman, she'd learned to map buildings by their sounds, their air currents. Thomas? She whispered into her stolen radio. Remember when I taught you about hospital ventilation systems? How can they be used to move through a building unseen? Thomas smiled grimly, understanding immediately. Chen, delay your breach. Let them think they have us trapped. Margaret, can you reach the main ventilation control? Already here. When I gave the signal, I hit the executive office from the south. They won't expect anyone to come through the ventilation shafts because they think a blind woman is helpless. Show them how wrong they are, Thomas replied, pride evident in his voice. The storm over Pine Grove intensified as Margaret prepared to prove that sometimes the most effective weapons aren't guns or tactical training, but knowledge and adaptation. In the darkness of the old mill, corporate power was about to learn that underestimating a blind nurse and a former sniper was their final mistake. The old mill's ventilation system groaned as Margaret moved through its network of ducts and shafts. Her fingers traced along metal seams, counting intersections, building a map in her mind. Below, she heard Hayes's teams spreading accelerants, preparing to destroy everything. Asset teams in position, Hayes reported, ready to initiate the sanitization protocol on your command. Do it, Cross ordered. But first, make sure the servers are secured. Those test results are worth billions in pharmaceutical patents. Thomas's voice came through Margaret's stolen radio. In position, South Corridor clear. Chen's teams are holding back, letting them think they have control. Margaret smiled in the darkness. They've forgotten something important about old lumber mills. The ventilation system was designed to clear sawdust. Which means, Thomas finished, the exhaust fans are industrial grade, powerful enough to affect the spread of accelerants. In the executive office, Alexander Cross reviewed evacuation plans on his laptop. Status of the Reed woman? Still searching, sir, Hayes replied. But she's blind. She can't get far. You don't understand, Cross snapped. 7 years ago, she was close to exposing our early trials. The hospital incident wasn't just about silencing her. Those records she marked in Braille, she created a paper trail we couldn't detect. Outside, Agent Chen received new intelligence. Thermal imaging shows they're spreading accelerant through the lower floors. But something's wrong with their pattern. They're missing key structural points. Because they don't know what Margaret knows, Thomas replied. About ventilation, about how fire moves through old buildings. They think being blind made her helpless. Instead, it made her notice things others miss. Margaret reached the main ventilation control room. Her fingers found the ancient control panel, reading the Braille labels she'd discovered during her earlier captivity. Thomas, they're about to learn a lesson about making assumptions. In the loading bay, Marcus Leone gathered his remaining Thunder Creek riders. North Star played us, used us to test their drugs on people in our territory. Time to return the favor. He keyed his radio. Reed, my men are clearing the east exit. Whatever you're planning, you've got a clear route out. Hayes noticed the Thunder Creek movements on security cameras. Sir, we've got a problem. The gang is turning against us. Expendable assets, Cross dismissed. Initiate the burn. Full containment protocol. The first charges were set, ready to ignite the accelerant. But when they triggered them, something unexpected happened. The mill's ancient ventilation system roared to life, powerful fans changing air pressure throughout the building. The accelerant, Hayes shouted. It's being pulled into the ventilation system. Margaret worked the controls with practiced precision, using skills learned from years of hospital maintenance. Amazing what you can accomplish when people underestimate you, she whispered. Thomas moved through the chaos, encountering less resistance as Ravencroft teams scrambled to adjust their containment plans. He reached the executive level just as Chen's voice came through his radio. FBI teams moving in, all exits covered. In the executive office, Cross watched his plans unravel. Hayes, get those servers out now. Everything we've built, the research, the trials, the distribution network, it's all in those drives. About that, Margaret's voice came through their own tactical radio channel. You should be more careful about where you store sensitive data. In the ventilation control room, Her fingers moved across a different set of drives, backups the corporate teams had missed. Hayes recognized the danger first. She's been in the building systems this whole time, using sound and touch to map everything while we focused on visual surveillance. And now, Thomas added, entering the executive office with practiced efficiency, she has access to everything. Every test, every trial, every death you caused, including the truth about her accident. Cross reached for a hidden weapon, but Thomas was faster. Years of sniper training made the disarm almost casual. You're done. The FBI has the building surrounded, and Margaret's already transmitted the backup data to federal servers. You don't understand, Cross snarled. Do you know how many lives our research will save, the advancements we've made? By testing experimental drugs on unsuspecting people, Margaret's voice came through the radio. By using gang territories as private laboratories? I understood perfectly. That's why you had to stop me 7 years ago. Hayes assessed the situation with professional detachment. Sir, we've lost containment. FBI teams are breaching the lower floors. Through the office windows, they watched. Chen's tactical teams moving in. The Thunder Creek Riders, led by Leone, were already surrendering, turning against their former corporate masters. It's over, Thomas said quietly. Your own arrogance destroyed you. You thought a blind woman was no threat, that her husband was just a retired veteran. You never wondered why she marked those files in Braille, never considered that losing her sight made her more dangerous, not less. Margaret made her way down from the ventilation control room, moving confidently through the darkness. The sound of FBI teams securing the building echoed through the corridors. In the executive office, she heard Cross being cuffed, and heard Hayes surrendering with professional resignation. Mrs. Reed, Cross called out as she entered, you have no idea what you've done. The lives that could have been saved. I know exactly what I've done, Margaret replied calmly. I've exposed a corporation that turned medicine into murder. And I did it because you thought blindness made me powerless. Instead, it taught me to see things you never could. Outside, the storm began to clear as FBI evidence teams moved through the mill. They found exactly what Margaret had discovered 7 years ago, proof of illegal drug trials, of corporate crimes hidden behind motorcycle gang activity, of a conspiracy that reached from street-level dealers to corporate boardrooms. Thomas watched as Chen's team secured the servers, the files, the evidence that would expose everything. You know they'll try to bury this under lawyers and corporate regulations. Let them try, Margaret replied, standing confidently in the darkness that had become her ally. Some things can't be hidden once they're brought to light. The night that began with a corporation thinking it could silence a blind woman ended with that same woman exposing their darkest secrets. In Pine Grove, Montana, the old lumber mill stood as a testament to a simple truth. Sometimes the most effective weapon against corruption isn't force or power, but the quiet strength of someone who refuses to be underestimated. Dawn broke over Pine Grove as a convoy of black SUVs rolled into town. Corporate lawyers and expensive suits emerged, phones already pressed to their ears. At the mill, FBI evidence teams worked methodically, documenting everything, while Margaret helped locate hidden servers and backup drives. They're moving fast, Agent Chen observed, watching the lawyers gather outside the police cordon. North Stars. Board of Directors has already issued statements denying everything. Of course they have, Thomas replied, studying surveillance photos of the arriving legal team. But they don't know what Margaret found in the hospital archives. In the makeshift FBI command center, Margaret's fingers moved across old medical files. These records go back 15 years. Every test subject, every trial, every death documented in Braille that their corporate auditors couldn't read. Richard Hayes, now in custody, watched the proceedings with professional interest. You know they'll bury this, he said to Thomas. They've got judges, politicians, regulatory officials, all in their pocket. Maybe, Thomas acknowledged. But you missed something important about my wife. She doesn't just sense things others miss. She plans in ways you never considered. Marcus Leone, seated with his remaining Thunder Creek riders, nodded toward the corporate lawyers. Those suits showing up means we were right. North Star was using us, making us test their drugs on people in our territory. Tell me about the other sites, Chen pressed. We know Pine Grove wasn't the only testing ground. 3 more locations, Leone confirmed. They picked places where the local cops were bought, where people wouldn't be missed. Used the gang's distribution network to move their experimental medications. Outside, Alexander Cross was being transferred to federal custody when his lead attorney arrived. Say nothing, the lawyer ordered. We're already filing motions to suppress evidence on corporate privacy grounds. They're scared, Margaret observed, hearing the tension in their voices, not just of what we found here, but of what else might come out. Thomas reviewed data from the seized servers, multiple testing sites using different gangs as cover. Ravencroft provided security, made sure no one looked too closely, but Margaret's hospital records proved they knew the drugs were dangerous. More than dangerous, Margaret added, her fingers tracing another file. Look at the death rates. They weren't just testing new medications. They were using vulnerable populations to test experimental compounds, things that would never pass FDA trials. Agent Chen received urgent updates from other FBI offices. We're finding connections to 3 major hospitals. Same pattern. Missing medications, unexplained deaths, records altered to hide the truth. Hayes shifted in his chair, considering his options. You know, Mrs. Reed, there's something you should understand about your accident 7 years ago. It wasn't just about silencing you. North Star needed to know if their memory suppression compound worked. Margaret went still. The drug they gave me during the procedure, the one that was supposed to be routine anesthesia. Experimental, Hayes confirmed. Designed to erase specific memories. The blindness was an unexpected side effect. Thomas's hand tightened on his chair, but his voice remained steady. You tested an unauthorized drug on her, tried to erase what she discovered, and now, Chen added, we have proof. Your own records show the order came directly from Cross himself. Outside, more corporate vehicles arrived. Not just lawyers now, but private security teams, media consultants, crisis managers, the machinery of corporate damage control spinning into action. They'll try to discredit you, Hayes warned. Make it look like a blind woman made mistakes, saw conspiracy, where there were just normal hospital operations. Let them try, Margaret replied calmly, because while they're focused on discrediting my testimony, they'll miss what I've really done. Every file I marked in Braille, every record I kept, it's all been verified by multiple sources. Paper, trails they never noticed because they couldn't read what was right in front of them. Leone turned to Chen. My men will testify about the drug tests, the cover-ups, everything. Time somebody stood up to these corporate bastards. In the FBI command center, evidence teams catalogued more servers, more documents, each piece connecting North Star Medical to illegal drug trials, to organized crime, to corporate corruption at the highest levels. Sir, one of Cross's lawyers urged, we need to get ahead of this issue. Statements about rogue employees, unauthorized testing, distance you from direct involvement. It won't work, Thomas observed quietly. Because Margaret didn't just find evidence of crimes. She found proof of pattern, systematic abuse of power, corporate decisions that turned medicine into murder. Margaret moved confidently through the command center, her other senses painting a clear picture of the activity around her. They thought taking my sight would silence me. Instead, it made me listen more carefully and notice things others missed. And now, everything they tried to hide is coming to light. Hayes watched her with newfound respect. You knew, didn't you? Even 7 years ago, you were planning for this moment, creating records they wouldn't think to check, building evidence they couldn't destroy. I was a nurse, Margaret replied simply. I took an oath to do no harm. When I discovered what North Star was doing, I had a choice: stay quiet or find a way to expose the truth. They thought blinding me would end the investigation. Instead, it just changed how I gathered evidence. Outside, the morning sun illuminated. A town transformed. Corporate power had arrived in force, ready to bury the truth under lawyers and money. But they were about to learn that some things couldn't be hidden. Not when a blind woman had spent 7 years preparing to expose their crimes, and her husband had the skills to help her bring everything into the light. The Pine Grove Police Station buzzed with activity as more federal agents arrived. In the conference room, Margaret sat with stacks of medical files while corporate media specialists held press conferences outside, trying to control the narrative. North Star Medical remains committed to patient safety, their spokesperson announced. These allegations stem from a misunderstanding by a former nurse with documented medical issues. Thomas watched the coverage with cold anger. They're trying to use your blindness against you, painting you as confused, unreliable, while missing the obvious, Margaret replied, fingers moving across another Braille-marked file. Every victim I documented, every illegal trial I recorded, it's all verified by multiple sources. Now their own data confirms everything. Agent Chen entered with new intelligence. Hayes is talking, giving us names of officials who helped cover up the drug trials, judges, regulators, even 2 state senators. Makes sense, Thomas observed. You don't run an operation this size without political protection. Hayes was their connection to former military assets, but someone higher up handled the official channels. Through the station windows, they watched more Thunder Creek riders arriving to give statements. Marcus Leone had convinced his men to turn on their corporate handlers, revealing locations of other testing sites. 7 more facilities, Leone explained, spreading a map across the table. Each one near a hospital, each one using local gangs for distribution and security. North Star provided the drugs. Ravencroft handled the cleanup when things went wrong. Margaret's head tilted slightly, hearing tension in approaching footsteps. Someone's coming. Federal marshal by the sound of the boots, but they're not moving. Right, Thomas moved instantly, years of training taking over. The would-be assassin, professional by his technique, found himself disarmed and pinned. North Star's getting desperate, Chen noted as real federal agents took the assassin into custody. This is their 3rd attempt to eliminate witnesses today. Hayes, watching from his secured room, nodded grimly. They'll keep coming. The board knows if this evidence reaches court, everything collapses, not just North Star. Half the pharmaceutical industry is connected to these trials. In the station's evidence, the room, Margaret discovered something new in the hospital records. These aren't just random test subjects. They targeted specific populations. Veterans with combat injuries, elderly patients with chronic conditions, people desperate for treatments their insurance wouldn't cover, using vulnerability as a screening tool. The Thunder Creek riders provided access to people who wouldn't be missed, Thomas added, while North Star used legitimate hospitals to find patients they could manipulate. Chen received urgent updates from other FBI offices. We've got protests starting outside 3 major hospitals. Former patients coming forward, claiming they were unknowingly enrolled in drug trials. They're losing control of the narrative, Thomas observed. Corporate damage control works best in the shadows. Once people start asking questions publicly, that's why they're scared, Margaret interrupted, holding up another file. These mortality rates, they knew the drugs were dangerous, kept testing anyway, because the potential profits outweighed the human cost. Outside, more corporate lawyers arrived, but their confidence was cracking. News vans lined the streets. As the story grew beyond their ability to contain, Chairman of the board is flying in, Hayes revealed. William Preston himself. When he shows up personally, it means they're planning something big, probably trying to contain this before their international operations are exposed. International, Chen pressed. Testing sites in countries with less oversight, using criminal organizations for distribution, just like here, but on a larger scale. North Star's entire research division is built on unauthorized trials. Margaret's fingers found a hidden pattern. In the medical records, these hospital transfers, they're not random. They were moving test subjects between facilities, hiding the real death toll by spreading it across multiple institutions. Thomas studied security footage of corporate teams arriving in town. Their tactical response is changing. These aren't just lawyers anymore. Preston is bringing in specialized contractors, Hayes explained, because he knows what's really at stake. North Star isn't just facing criminal charges. These trials were used to fast-track drug approvals, manipulate stock prices, and secure government contracts. If the evidence goes public, the entire pharmaceutical industry could face congressional investigation. Through the station windows, they watched as media crews interviewed former patients, family members of victims, even ex-hospital staff coming forward with their own stories. They thought they could bury this, Margaret said quietly. Use their money and power to hide the truth, but they never understood what really happens when you take someone's sight. Her fingers traced another document. You learn to see patterns others miss, to gather evidence they never notice. Thomas moved to stand behind his wife, years of sniper training telling him the real fight was just beginning. They'll try to destroy the evidence, discredit the witnesses, bury everything under legal motions and corporate procedures. Let them try, Margaret replied calmly, because while they're focused on what they can see, they'll miss what's really happening. Sometimes the truth isn't in what's visible, it's in what people overlook, what they dismiss as unimportant. Outside, Preston's private jet was landing at the local airport. Corporate power was gathering its full strength, preparing to crush anyone who threatened their secrets. But in the Pine Grove police station, a blind woman who'd spent 7 years gathering evidence they never thought to check was about to prove that true justice doesn't need eyes to see the truth. William Preston's arrival transformed the Pine Grove Sheriff's Station into an impromptu corporate war room. Surrounded by lawyers and security, North Star's chairman radiated the confidence of a man accustomed to making problems disappear. Mrs. Reed, Preston's voice carried a practiced charm. I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this privately, like we discussed hospital safety protocols 7 years ago. Margaret's reply was steel wrapped in silk. Thomas watched Preston's security detail, ex-military professionals trying to look like ordinary bodyguards. His snipers' training noted their positions, their subtle hand signals, the bulges of concealed weapons. You're nervous, William, Thomas observed. Your security keeps checking the windows. Afraid of what's coming? Hayes, still in custody but watching intently, caught the slight tension in Preston's jaw. He knows about Geneva, Hayes said quietly to Agent Chen. The offshore accounts, the international testing programs. Elaborate, Chen pressed. North Star has research facilities in countries with minimal oversight. They perfect the formulas there, using local gangs just like the Thunder Creek Riders, before bringing successful compounds back for official trials. Margaret's fingers moved across another file. The shipping manifests match. Medications arriving from overseas, straight to hospitals in the testing network. No FDA inspection, no quality control. Through the station windows, they watched more. Corporate teams arriving, not just lawyers now, but forensic accountants, data specialists. Everyone needed to contain a major scandal. The board is meeting in an emergency session, Preston announced. We're prepared to offer a very generous settlement, complete medical care for Mrs. Reed, compensation for any inconvenience. You mean buying my silence, Margaret replied. Like you tried to buy the silence of other witnesses? The ones who died in accidents? After refusing your offers, Thomas noted a subtle shift in Preston's security team. Your personnel file was an interesting read. Before North Star, you worked for pharmaceutical companies in South America. Lots of unexplained deaths in their trial programs too. Preston's charm cracked slightly. Careful, Mr. Reed. You're approaching dangerous territory. Like the territory you entered when you personally ordered the use of experimental drugs on my wife. Thomas's voice remained calm, but carried lethal intent. Hayes gave us the authorization documents. Your signature, your direct orders. Outside, Marcus Leone organized his remaining Thunder Creek riders into a protective screen around the station. They'd learned their lesson about corporate loyalty, now determined to protect the witnesses who could expose everything. More victims are coming forward in Burlington, Chen reported. 3 former nurses, 2 doctors, all claiming they were silenced when they questioned drug trial procedures. It's falling apart, William, Hayes called from his secured room. The other board members, they're already talking to federal prosecutors, cutting deals to save themselves. Margaret held up another file. This is interesting. Transfer records, showing test subjects moved between hospitals, spreading out the deaths to avoid statistical patterns. Very clever. Almost impossible to track unless you can read the Braille notes I left in each file. You don't understand what's at stake. Preston's voice hardened. The research we're doing, it's going to revolutionize medicine, save millions of lives. By sacrificing the vulnerable, Margaret's reply cut deep. By using desperate people as unwitting test subjects. That's not medicine, Mr. Preston. That's murder for profit. Thomas received urgent intelligence from his old Marine contacts. Your Swiss accounts are being frozen. Interpol's involved now. Those offshore research facilities you thought were hidden? They're being raided as we speak. Preston's phone buzzed constantly. Board members demanding answers, lawyers warning of liability, partners trying to distance themselves from the growing scandal. You've built quite a house of cards, Margaret observed, hearing the increasing tension in Preston's movements. But you forgot something crucial about the truth. It doesn't need sight to be seen. It just needs someone patient enough to gather the evidence, piece by piece. Someone's accessing our secure servers, one of Preston's tech specialists reported urgently. Multiple breaches, data being downloaded. Because while you were watching us, Thomas explained, our friends in federal law enforcement were following the electronic trail. Every transaction, every test result, every death you tried to hide, it's all coming to light. Through the station windows, they watched more media arriving. Not just local news now, but national networks, international press. The story was growing beyond any corporate ability to contain. Your board members are running scared, Chen added. 3 more turned state's evidence in the last hour. They're afraid of what else Mrs. Reed might have documented, what other evidence is hidden in those Braille files. Preston's security team shifted nervously as more FBI agents arrived. The balance of power was visibly tilting, corporate authority crumbling in the face of accumulated evidence. You can still make a deal, Hayes suggested to his former boss, but it has to be now, before the international allegations surface, because what you did here in Pine Grove, it's just the surface of North Star's operations. Margaret held up one final file, like this report from your Geneva facility, the one documenting fatality rates from unauthorized drug trials, the one your board never saw, but I found through my contacts in international medicine. Funny how losing my sight made me rely more on global connections, on networks you never thought to monitor. Preston's face hardened as he realized the true extent of his exposure. The evidence wasn't just about local drug trials or corporate corruption. Margaret Reed had spent 7 years building a case that would expose decades of pharmaceutical industry crimes. Outside, autumn wind scattered leaves across the station parking lot as corporate power faced the ultimate threat. Truth backed by undeniable evidence. The chairman of North Star Medical was learning that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one you can see, but the one who's learned to see things differently. Night fell over Pine Grove as Preston made his final move. Multiple vehicles approached the station from different directions, their engines nearly silent. But Margaret, whose hearing had sharpened over years of blindness, caught the subtle sound of tactical gear shifting. "Thomas," she said quietly, "4 teams moving in. Military precision, not like the previous contractors." "Elite wetwork squad," Hayes confirmed from his secure room. "Preston's last resort. If he can't contain the evidence legally." Thomas was already moving. "Chen, north and east approaches are compromised. These aren't ordinary contractors. They're apex predators." Through the station windows, they watched Preston's legal team making a show of leaving, creating a distraction. But Margaret heard what others missed: the soft click of weapons being assembled, the whisper of tactical radio traffic. "They're using subsonic ammunition," Thomas noted, "planning to make this look like a tragic accident. Gas leak maybe, electrical fire, just like the other accidents that killed witnesses." "Like the offer you made to Dr. Chen," Margaret added, her fingers moving across a final set of files. "Before he had his car accident, after questioning your trial protocols." The first attack came as a power surge, knocking out the station's main electrical system. But Margaret had spent years navigating darkness. Thomas heard her calm voice through their secure radio link. "Ventilation system just changed pitch. They're introducing something through the air handlers." Marcus Leone and his Thunder Creek riders proved their redemption quickly, securing the building's perimeter. They knew these tactics, had once been part of similar operations. Now they used that knowledge to protect the witnesses they'd once helped hunt. "Multiple breach points," Thomas reported calmly, his sniper training evident in every precise movement. "They're good, very good, but they're fighting blind." Margaret smiled slightly. "In darkness, my hearing gives us the advantage. East corridor, 3 men moving in formation. South entrance, 2 more with heavier gear." The first team breached through a side door, expecting to find confused targets in the darkness. Instead, they encountered Thomas Reed, who'd spent decades learning to turn others' expectations against them. The fight was brief, professional, and entirely one-sided. "Status," Chen demanded through emergency channels. 5 down, non-lethal," Thomas replied. "But their backup teams are more cautious now. These aren't thugs. They're Special Forces veterans. They'll adapt quickly." Margaret worked rapidly in the darkness, securing the final pieces of evidence, while Hayes provided crucial intelligence about Preston's tactics. "He's getting reports of international raids," Hayes transmitted. "North Star facilities in Geneva, Singapore, Buenos Aires, all being hit simultaneously. Through the station windows, they saw Preston's composed facade crack as his phone buzzed with urgent messages. Board members surrendering to federal authorities, bank accounts frozen, stock, prices plummeting as the story broke worldwide. "Your empire's falling, William," Hayes called out. "Those offshore accounts you thought were hidden, Interpol just seized everything. The board is turning on you to save themselves." The second assault team hit from multiple angles, using sophisticated and breach charges, but Margaret heard their approach through the building's infrastructure. "Thomas, they're coming through maintenance access, using the same routes I mapped earlier." "Because they don't realize," Thomas replied, moving to intercept, "that losing your sight made you notice things they never considered." The fight in the darkness was swift, clinical. Thomas had spent his military career learning to operate in shadows. These corporate soldiers, for all their training, weren't prepared for a man who'd made darkness his ally. "The evidence is secure," Chen reported. "Multiple federal agencies have copies. Europol is moving on their research facilities. It's over." Preston's last team made a desperate push, more direct than professional. but the Thunder Creek Riders held the perimeter while Thomas neutralized the immediate threats. Margaret, untouchable in her darkness, continued cataloging evidence that would destroy one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. "You don't understand what you've done," Preston's voice cracked with desperation. "The research, the advancement we've made, built on death and suffering," Margaret replied calmly. "Each advancement paid for with the lives of people you saw as expendable. But you made a crucial mistake, Mr. Preston. You thought blinding me would keep me from seeing the truth." The final confrontation came as federal tactical teams arrived. In force, Preston's remaining security surrendered professionally, knowing when a battle was lost. The chairman of North Star Medical watched his world collapse as Margaret Reed held the final piece of evidence, his own signature on orders authorizing illegal drug trials. "It's almost poetic," Hayes observed as Preston was taken into custody. "You tried to silence her by taking her sight. Instead, you gave her the perfect tools to expose everything." Dawn broke over Pine Grove as international news crews arrived. The story was everywhere now. A pharmaceutical giant exposed, a criminal, empire revealed, all because they underestimated a blind woman and her husband. "They thought making you blind would make you helpless," Thomas said quietly as federal agents catalogued the evidence Margaret had gathered. "Instead, it made you more dangerous than they could imagine." The morning sun illuminated a changed world. In Pine Grove, Montana, a small town had become the epicenter of a global scandal. A pharmaceutical giant had fallen, brought down not by corporate rivals or government regulators, but by a blind woman, who proved that true justice doesn't need eyes to see the truth. The Pine Grove Sheriff's Station had become a global media center. News helicopters circled overhead, while reporters from every major network crowded the parking lot. Inside, Margaret Reed continued working with federal investigators, her fingers moving across files that would shake the pharmaceutical industry to its core. "Stock markets are in turmoil," Agent Chen reported. "North Star shares are worthless, but they're dragging down other pharmaceutical companies. Everyone's wondering who's next." Thomas watched the corporate lawyers departing, their confident facades crumbling. "They're running scared." Hayes's testimony implicated 3 other major drug companies in the illegal trials, Chen continued, because North Star wasn't unique. "They were just the ones who got caught," Hayes explained from his secured room. "The whole industry uses similar methods, finding desperate people, testing dangerous compounds, hiding the casualties." Margaret held up another file, like this report from Central Hospital. Their administrator just confessed to coordinating with 5 different companies, all using the same methods North Star perfected. Through the station windows, they watched Marcus Leone organizing his Thunder Creek Riders to protect arriving witnesses, former test subjects, hospital staff, even corporate whistleblowers, all coming forward now that North Star's protection network had crumbled. "It's not just American companies," Hayes continued. "The international connections, pharmaceutical giants in Europe, Asia, and all using criminal organizations for distribution and testing. Preston's arrest opened floodgates nobody can close." Agent Chen's phone buzzed constantly with updates. Raids happening across 3 continents, research facilities, corporate, offices, private testing sites. Everyone's scrambling to destroy evidence, but they can't move fast enough, because they never understood what Margaret really did, Thomas observed proudly. "She didn't just gather evidence about North Star, she created a template for exposing the whole industry." Margaret's fingers traced another document. "Hospital records are standardized. Once you know the pattern, how they hide illegal trials, how they disguise deaths, you can find it anywhere. I've been teaching other investigators what to look for." Outside, more Thunder Creek Riders arrived, their leather jackets now marking them as protectors rather than threats. They'd seen corporate power's true face and chosen their side. Class action lawsuits are being filed hourly, Chen noted. Victims' families, former patients, medical staff who were threatened into silence. The legal tsunami is just beginning. Hayes shifted in his chair. You know they'll try to bury this. The industry has too much money, too much political influence. They can try, Margaret replied calmly, but you can't hide bodies forever. Every hospital I investigated, every record I translated to Braille, it all shows the same pattern of abuse. And now people know what to look for. Thomas received intelligence from his old Marine contacts. Corporate cleanup crews are mobilizing, worldwide, trying to destroy records, silence witnesses, and contain the damage. Too late, Chen smiled. Mrs. Reed's evidence is already in the hands of every major law enforcement agency. The pattern is exposed. No amount of corporate money can hide it now. Through the station's open windows, they heard protesters gathering. Not angry mobs, but former patients, medical professionals, families of victims, all demanding justice, all carrying stories that matched Margaret's evidence. The industry's biggest weakness, Margaret explained, was thinking blindness made me less observant. Instead, it taught me to notice things others miss, patterns in hospital routines, changes in medication protocols, the quiet disappearance of questioning. Patience. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. That's why Preston's security teams failed. They were trained to watch for visual surveillance, electronic monitoring. Nobody taught them to guard against someone who could hear their plans, feel their movements, sense their intentions. More federal agents arrived as evidence continued pouring in. Hospital administrators across the country were competing to cooperate, each hoping to avoid being the next North Star scandal. They're calling you the Dark Angel of medicine on the news, Chen told Margaret. The blind nurse who exposed the industry's darkest secrets. I'm just someone who remembered her oath, Margaret replied. First, do no harm. When I discovered what these companies were doing, blindness didn't stop me from gathering evidence. It just made me more thorough. Thomas watched as more corporate officials were brought in for questioning. They thought making you blind would make you helpless. Instead, it made you the perfect witness. Someone who could gather evidence they never thought to hide. Outside, the autumn wind carried the sound of more arriving vehicles. Federal teams, international investigators, medical oversight committees, all converging on Pine Grove to learn what Margaret Reed had discovered. This is just the beginning, Hayes predicted. Once people understand how deep this goes, how many companies are involved. That's why they're so scared, Margaret finished. Because it's not just about North Star anymore. It's about exposing an entire system built on treating human lives as experimental data. Congressional hearing rooms were being prepared in Washington as Margaret Reed continued working in the fortified FBI field office in Burlington. The small-town sheriff's station had become too vulnerable as threats mounted from desperate corporate interests. 3 more assassination teams identified, Thomas reported, studying surveillance photos. Not just North Star now, other companies are getting nervous about what you might have discovered in their hospital records. They should be nervous. Margaret's fingers moved across new files arriving hourly. The pattern North Star used, I found it in 6 other major pharmaceutical companies. Same methods, same cover-ups, same fatal trials. The Washington, D.C. winter wind cut through the crowd gathered outside the Capitol building. Inside the packed hearing room, Margaret Reed sat before the Congressional Oversight Committee, her presence commanding attention despite her small frame. Thomas watched from nearby, noting the subtle signs of corporate security teams scattered throughout the audience. Mrs. Reed, the committee chairman began, please explain how you first discovered these illegal drug trials. Margaret's voice was clear and strong. It started with discrepancies in hospital records, medications that disappeared from inventory, patients with unexplained complications, deaths that didn't match reported conditions. Through the room's acoustics, She heard pharmaceutical executives shifting nervously in their seats. Her years without sight had taught her to read tension in the smallest sounds. 3 more teams moving into position, Thomas whispered into his concealed radio. The Thunder Creek Riders, now positioned throughout the building, acknowledged silently. Hayes's testimony had preceded Margaret's, laying groundwork about corporate practices. Now, as Margaret began revealing specific evidence, the industry's representatives grew increasingly agitated. We have documentation, she continued, holding up files marked in Braille, showing systematic abuse of patient trust. Experimental drugs administered without consent, deaths concealed through falsified records, victims chosen from vulnerable populations. Objection, a pharmaceutical industry lawyer stood. These allegations are based on circumstantial... Like this report, Margaret interrupted, producing another file, showing your company's board explicitly authorizing illegal trials in gang-controlled territories, or these mortality statistics carefully spread across multiple hospitals to hide the pattern. James noticed movement in the gallery. Corporate. Contractors shifting positions, hands moving toward concealed weapons. But the Thunder Creek Riders were ready, their reformed gang now serving as protectors of truth. Mrs. Reed, a sympathetic senator, pressed, "How did you manage to gather this evidence while blind?" "They assumed blindness made me helpless," Margaret replied calmly. "Instead, it made me more observant. I learned to feel inconsistencies in paper trails, hear tension in voices when questions were asked, sense patterns they thought were invisible. Through hidden earpieces, Thomas coordinated with security teams as another corporate hit squad was intercepted in the building's basement. The industry's desperation was showing in their increasingly reckless attempts to silence witnesses. "We have Mr. Hayes's testimony about international operations," the chairman continued. "Can you elaborate on what you discovered?" Margaret produced more files, each marked in both Braille and text. "These companies use the same methods globally: criminal organizations for distribution, vulnerable populations for testing, corrupt officials for cover. The pattern never changed, only the locations." Agent Chen, monitoring from a secure room, reported through Thomas's earpiece. 2 more pharmaceutical executives just turned themselves in. They're offering evidence about industry-wide practices. In the gallery, corporate lawyers whispered urgently into phones as their clients' defenses crumbled. Margaret's testimony was methodically exposing decades of systematic abuse. The companies believed their methods were undetectable, she explained. "They never considered that losing my sight would lead me to develop new ways of gathering evidence. Every document I marked in Braille, every record I preserved, it all tells the same story of corporate greed prioritized over human lives." Thomas intercepted another potential threat, a corporate cleaner trying to access the ventilation system. The Thunder Creek Riders had been right about the industry tactics, their former criminal connections now helping prevent similar attacks. "We're receiving reports from hospitals nationwide," the chairman announced. "Administrators coming forward, confirming everything you've testified about. The pattern you identified is being found in facilities across the country." Margaret nodded. "Because once you know what to look for, the evidence can't stay hidden. I've been teaching other investigators how to detect these operations. The techniques I developed after losing my sight are now helping expose similar crimes everywhere." Through the hearing room's acoustics, she tracked more movement. Corporate security teams retreating as their assassination plans were thwarted. The industry's violent response was only confirming their guilt. "Mrs. Reed," another senator began, "these companies thought blinding you would silence you. Instead, it made me more dangerous to them," Margaret finished, "because I learned to gather evidence they never thought to conceal, to sense patterns they assumed were invisible, to hear the truth in their attempts to hide it." Hayes's voice came through secure channels. 3 more board members requesting immunity deals. "The whole industry is collapsing as she speaks." Outside, winter sunshine illuminated crowds of supporters, former patients, medical whistleblowers, families of victims. Inside, Margaret's testimony continued, methodically exposing decades of corporate crimes. They tried to bury the truth, she told the committee, using money, legal threats, and violence. But they never understood that sometimes the clearest vision comes from learning to see things differently, from paying attention to what others overlook. Thomas watched pharmaceutical executives leaving rapidly, their phones buzzing with news of stock prices plummeting, investigations expanding, evidence mounting. The industry's darkest secrets were being exposed, not by regulatory oversight or corporate whistleblowers, but by a blind nurse who turned her disability into a powerful tool for uncovering truth. As winter wind rattled the Capitol's windows, Margaret Reed continued her testimony, proving that sometimes justice doesn't need eyes to see the truth. It just needs someone willing to look beyond the surface, to feel the patterns others miss, to hear the stories hidden in silence. The second day of congressional hearings brought chaos to the pharmaceutical industry. Stock markets worldwide reacted as Margaret Reed's testimony continued exposing decades of systematic abuse. In the hearing room, corporate lawyers watched helplessly as their carefully constructed defenses crumbled. "These patient records," Margaret explained, her fingers moving across braille-marked documents, show identical patterns across multiple companies, not just North Star. Every major pharmaceutical corporation used the same methods for illegal trials. Thomas noticed 3 more corporate security teams entering the building, their movements professional but desperate, lacking the confidence of earlier attempts. The Thunder Creek Riders, positioned throughout the Capitol, tracked them silently. "Mrs. Reed," a congressman pressed, "can you explain how these companies coordinated their activities?" "They used a shared network," Margaret replied, producing another file. "Criminal organizations for distribution, corrupt hospital administrators for access to patients, private security firms for cleanup. The same infrastructure, just different corporate logos. Through concealed earpieces, Agent Chen updated them on the industry's collapse. 4 more pharmaceutical CEOs resigned in the last hour, stock prices in free fall, European markets in chaos. His voice came through secure channels. Board members are turning on each other. Everyone's rushing to make immunity deals, trying to avoid being the last one holding the bag. Margaret heard the tension rising in the gallery. Pharmaceutical. Executives making urgent calls, lawyers abandoning prepared strategies, corporate security shifting nervously as more evidence emerged. These death rates, she continued, holding up statistical analyses, were deliberately spread across multiple hospitals to hide patterns. But once you know how to track the numbers, how to feel the connections in the data, the truth becomes clear. Thomas intercepted another corporate hit team in the building's service corridor. Their tactics were getting sloppy, desperation overriding training. The Thunder Creek Riders moved like shadows, preventing any approach to the hearing room. Testimony is being corroborated nationwide, the committee chairman announced. Hospital administrators coming forward, confirming illegal trials in their facilities. "Mrs. Reed, how did you identify these patterns?" "They assumed blindness would limit my investigation," Margaret explained. "Instead, it forced me to develop new methods. Every document I converted to Braille became permanent evidence they couldn't alter. Every pattern I discovered through touch revealed connections they thought were hidden." Through the room's acoustics, she tracked more movement. Corporate security, teams retreating as their last plans failed. The industry's violent response had only confirmed their guilt to the watching world. "International updates," Chen reported through secure channels. "Raids ongoing at research facilities in 12 countries. Everyone's finding exactly what Mrs. Reed described. Illegal trials, covered-up deaths, systematic abuse. Marcus Leone, coordinated Thunder Creek teams as they intercepted another corporate cleanup crew. "They're getting desperate," he reported, "using local muscle now, not just professionals." "Because the professionals are running," Hayes added. "Nobody wants to be connected to what's being exposed. The whole industry is toxic now." Margaret produced more files, each marked with both braille and text. These records show how they chose their victims, vulnerable populations, people without resources to fight back. They targeted those they thought wouldn't be missed. Thomas watched pharmaceutical executives practically running from the hearing room as Margaret's testimony continued. Their phones buzzed constantly with news of collapsing stock prices, criminal investigations, mounting evidence. "We're receiving reports," another congressman announced, "of similar operations being exposed in Canada, Britain, Germany. This appears to be a global conspiracy." "Because the pharmaceutical industry operated globally," Margaret confirmed. "Using the same methods, the same cover-ups, the same disregard for human life. They just assumed no one would connect the patterns. Through hidden cameras, they watched corporate security teams abandoning their posts. The industry's protective structure was collapsing as rapidly as its legal defenses. 3 more hospital networks under federal investigation," Chen updated. "Medical boards launching internal reviews. The whole healthcare system is being scrutinized." Margaret's voice remained steady as she presented more evidence. "They thought making me blind would protect their secrets. Instead, it made me develop ways to gather evidence they never thought to hide. Every threat they made, every attempt at silence, just proved how much they feared exposure." Hayes's intelligence continued flowing. "Board members are fleeing the country. Corporate jets filing. Flight plans to non-extradition countries. Everyone's trying to escape what's coming." Outside, winter sun illuminated growing crowds of supporters, medical professionals, former patients, families of victims. Inside, Margaret's testimony methodically dismantled decades of corporate corruption. The industry's fatal mistake, she told the committee, was believing that disability meant weakness. They never understood that sometimes losing one way of seeing helps you discover others. The truth doesn't need eyes. It just needs someone willing to look beyond the surface. Thomas coordinated with security as the last corporate teams withdrew, their assassination plans thwarted, their employers' crimes exposed. The pharmaceutical industry was learning that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one you can see, but the one who's learned to see through darkness to find truth. Hayes leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room as Margaret's voice echoed through the chambers. He knew that the storm they had set in motion was only beginning. The pharmaceutical titans were no longer a faceless threat. They were scrambling to save whatever remnants of power they could. Hayes's team had been instrumental in making sure that escape wasn't an option for them. "What's our next move?" Thomas asked, his attention divided between the monitors and the live stream of the hearings. "We maintain pressure," Marcus answered quickly, his eyes sharp. "We keep exposing. We've already made them too visible. The public's eyes are on them now, and they're feeling it." Margaret didn't flinch, even as the weight of her revelations continued to echo through the halls. "The public is only part of it. What we really need is a deep, sustained overhaul of the system. Exposing the rot is the first step, but real change requires dismantling the systems that allowed this to flourish for so long." "Like the legal protections?" Chen asked, an edge to her voice. "Exactly," Margaret responded. "These corporations relied on loopholes and outdated laws to shield themselves. We need new regulations, transparency, accountability, and that means we need to pressure lawmakers to act, not just react." As she spoke, the images of pharmaceutical executives fleeing the country flashed across the screens, juxtaposed with the public support pouring in for the victims who had fought back. But it wasn't just the elites who were panicking now. The entire system that had protected them was starting to crack. "We've started something they can't undo," Hayes said. "But they still have a lot of power left. They'll fight back with everything they have." Thomas met his gaze, his expression grim. "Then we fight harder." Margaret's voice resonated once more, steady and resolute. "They underestimated the human will to expose the truth. That will is unstoppable, no matter how hard they try to bury it." A commotion outside the hearing room caught their attention. The doors flung open, and a wave of protesters surged forward, carrying signs demanding justice and reform. It wasn't just a handful of people anymore. It was a movement. The energy in the room shifted. A collective resolve hung in the air. "We've won the battle," Marcus said, eyes on the unfolding scene. "But now the war begins." The room fell, silent for a moment, as each person understood the weight of those words. The fight had only just begun. Outside, the protesters' chants grew louder, their collective voices an unmistakable demand for accountability. Inside the committee room, the sense of urgency was palpable. The momentum had shifted, but as Margaret had already pointed out, exposing the truth was only the beginning. It would take far more to dismantle the complex web of corporate influence and corruption that had ensnared so much of the healthcare system. Hayes looked at the monitors again, then at the growing crowd outside. "They think they can control the narrative, but we've already changed it. Now we need to make sure they don't get the chance to rewrite it." Chen nodded, tapping away at her tablet. "We've already got a media blitz lined up. Interviews, news reports, investigative documentaries, everything set to amplify Margaret's testimony. But we'll need more than public outrage. We need actionable pressure. We need to keep the focus on the individuals, not just the corporations." Thomas stepped forward, his gaze serious. "We need to hit them where it hurts, by going after their assets, their networks. If we can expose their financial ties, their hidden accounts, we can cripple their ability to fight back." Margaret turned to face him, her expression unwavering. "We'll need a team on the inside, someone who can navigate their labyrinth of accounts. They'll hide everything they can, but someone on the inside always knows where the bodies are buried." "Already on it," Marcus said. "I've got someone inside their legal team feeding us intel. They're sweating over every document, every communication. We've got a chance to track down their hidden funds, their covert operations. The more we get, the more we can force their hand." Hayes glanced at the clock. "We need a coordinated strike. Hit them on all fronts, publicly, financially, legally." Margaret's voice was calm, but her words carried weight. "We can't let up. The media will move on. The public's attention will wane. But we need to make sure this is a constant, inescapable pressure. We force lawmakers to act. We force the public to keep demanding answers. And we don't let them forget what they've done." The team exchanged determined looks. They'd already come so far, undermining a global empire of corruption, toppling executives, exposing the toxic practices that had plagued millions. But the fight was far from over. They weren't just going after corrupt companies anymore. They were dismantling an entire system that had allowed these atrocities to fester. Thomas checked his earpiece, a signal from one of their field teams. The last of the corporate teams have abandoned their safe houses. They're in full retreat mode, trying to consolidate what they can. We have intel on their final plans. They're attempting to organize a last-ditch legal defense, but they're divided. Their internal systems are collapsing. "Good," Marcus said, his voice sharp. "Let them scatter. The more fragmented they are, the easier it is to expose them for what they are." Chen stood up from her station. "I'll work with the media teams to make sure every new piece of evidence is amplified. We need to get this into the headlines. Make it so visible that they can't escape scrutiny. Every piece of information we leak, every new revelation, will make them weaker." Margaret nodded, her expression a mixture of resolve and exhaustion. "And we hold the line. We can't afford to give them a second to regroup. If we stop now, they'll come back stronger. This is the moment we make them feel like they can never recover. That's the plan, Hayes said, his voice steady. We push until they break. The room fell silent for a moment as each member of the team understood the gravity of their mission. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting to reshape the very system that had allowed such corruption to flourish for decades. And with each passing day, they could feel that the winds of change were gaining strength as the hearing continued and the weight of the revelations stacked higher. Thomas watched the faces of the executives, once so confident, now stricken with fear. Their empire, built on deceit and manipulation, was beginning to crumble. And they had no idea just how much more was coming. Margaret's testimony had been the spark. Now it was up to them to turn it into a fire that could never be extinguished. The weeks that followed were a blur of action and unrest. Every piece of evidence, every new revelation was weaponized to drive the narrative forward. Margaret's testimony had become a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance, not just against the pharmaceutical giants, but against a system that had long allowed the powerful to operate without consequence. Corporate executives scrambled, some fleeing the country while others scrambled to secure last-minute deals, hoping to salvage what they could from the wreckage. But the world was watching, and no matter how far they ran, there was nowhere to hide. Thomas, Marcus, Chen, and Hayes worked tirelessly behind the scenes, pulling the strings, amplifying the pressure from every angle. The financial networks were exposed, the hidden accounts unearthed, and public outcry reached a fever pitch. Margaret's face had become iconic, not just for the strength she embodied, but for the relentless pursuit of truth she represented. The hearings continued. The cameras never stopped rolling. With each passing day, more and more whistleblowers come forward, each adding another layer of corruption to the already towering pile. Politicians, once complicit in the industry's protection, now had no choice but to listen. Investigations expanded to every corner of the globe as the industry's grip on power faltered, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. New regulations were drafted. Laws that had shielded corporate malfeasance were dismantled. Transparency became a requirement, not a luxury. For the first time in decades, the pharmaceutical industry was being forced to reckon with its past and its future. Margaret stood before the committee one last time, her voice unwavering as she summarized the years of struggle and the long road ahead. They thought they could bury the truth, she said, but the truth doesn't disappear. It rises, it spreads, it takes root, and now, no matter how they fight it, they will never be able to erase the damage they've done. We won't let them. Sharpshooter committee room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Outside, the crowds were still there, larger than ever. The movement had become more than just a fight against the pharmaceutical industry. It was a movement for justice, for accountability, and for a future where the voices of the oppressed could never again be ignored. Hayes stood by the door, watching as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. His team had done the impossible. They had broken a system that had seemed invincible, and they had done it together. As the doors of the committee room closed behind them, Thomas placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We did it," she smiled, the exhaustion still evident in her eyes, but so was something else, hope. A quiet, unwavering certainty that the world had finally started to change, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were winning. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in decades, it felt like the right side was on the winning team. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them. Out! And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.